Hello, and welcome to this final lesson in our series from the Gospel of John. In this particular lesson, we'll be looking at the first part of chapter 6, and we'll be focusing on the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. If you remember when we began this series, I pointed out to you that the Gospel of John is considered to be the other gospel. As when seen in comparison with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it is very different. The other three we call the Synoptic Gospels because we see them together and they're very similar. In fact, as I mentioned before, most of Mark is included in either either Mark or Matthew, or in both. John was written many years after the other three, maybe 30, 40 years after the other three. And things had arisen in the church by then, and John is writing from a whole different perspective. John is writing as an eyewitness of Jesus' ministry, and he is addressing, though, some of the things that have developed in the church as of the time of his writing. And so he tells the story of Jesus' ministry from a little different perspective for a little different purpose. Again, I would remind you that we do not read the Gospels as being a historical diary of Jesus' ministry. Each of them was written with a different perspective, and they include details that meet their perspective, and John is no exception. But we call it the other gospel because it is so different. For example, we've mentioned before, most of the ministry of Jesus that's described in the Synoptic Gospels takes place in Galilee. Most of the ministry of Jesus described in John's Gospel takes place in Jerusalem or Judea. Now, having said that, we've looked at several lessons that took place in Galilee, and again today we'll be back in Galilee. But when you read the majority of John's Gospel, you'll see him describing incidents that took place in Jerusalem or Judea. John only gives us the account of 7 miracles. The Synoptics give us many miracles. However, the Synoptics treat them as miracles, that is, supernatural events. John doesn't call them miracles, he calls them signs. By calling them a sign, he is suggesting that it was more than just a supernatural event. It was an event that happened so that Jesus might teach his followers who he was and what it meant to be the Messiah. And in fact, in each of John's 7 signs that he describes, following the event, there is a lengthy discourse that explains the meaning of that particular sign. We are looking today at the miracle or the sign of the feeding of the 5,000. And following, in chapter 6, following the description of the incident that we're going to be covering in this lesson, there is a lengthy discourse wherein Jesus explains to his followers the meaning of that particular sign or miracle. Okay, with that background, let's talk about the setting for this particular event. Now, it's interesting that I said John only includes 7 miracles or signs in his gospel, yet this one, the feeding of the 5,000, is the only miracle or sign, except for the resurrection, that is described by all 4 gospel writers. And even though all 4 of them have described the same event, they have given a few different details. What we know is that while Jesus had been in that first trip in Galilee, at the marriage feast at Cana of Galilee, turned the water into wine, went to Capernaum. After a while there, he goes back to Jerusalem, where he celebrates the Passover. While he's in Jerusalem, he has the encounter with Nicodemus. While he's in Jerusalem, he performs certain signs, certain miracles, and John tells us that, in fact, he did not entrust himself to the people because he understood that they believed in him as a miracle worker and not as the Messiah. And if he had identified himself as a Messiah, they would have wanted to make him a military soldier or a military hero at that point to overthrow Rome rather than understanding the true nature of his messiahship. So he didn't. He leaves, he goes back through to Galilee, and this time he goes through Samaria. And remember the lesson where he encounters the Samaritan woman. After ministering there, he goes on back to Cana of Galilee, where he had started out. And while he is there, he heals the centurion's son. Not the centurion's son, the nobleman's son. We believe these are two separate events. The other gospel writers describe the healing of the centurion's son. John describes the healing of the nobleman's son. We believe he was an official in the palace of Herod Antipas. After he has done that, he then stays in Galilee for a while until there is a Jewish festival, and then he retires. He decides to go back to Jerusalem for an unnamed Jewish feast. While he is there, he heals the man at the pool of Bethsaida, and then because that was on the Sabbath and stirred up opposition, Jesus decides that he has confrontation with the Jewish leadership there in Jerusalem. He decides to leave, and it is at this time that he goes back to Galilee. Now again, in John's Gospel, he's going back and forth between Jerusalem and Galilee several times. In the Synoptics, we do not have a discussion of these trips back and forth. The other Gospels only mention one Passover. John mentions 3 Passovers, plus this unnamed feast. It is in chapter 6 where the lesson picks up. And remember, there was no verse designation or chapter designations. This is one continuous flow. And after Jesus, having had that confrontation with the Jews, the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem, because he had healed the man on the Sabbath, John tells us, chapter 6, verse 1, sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. Sometime after this. Many commentators reading this with the synoptics together say that we're talking about maybe as much as a year. But at some period of time, at some point in time, a period of time after his confrontation with the Jewish leadership, he goes back to back to Galilee, probably to Capernaum, because that was his home base. And then John just simply describes and says, sometime after this, maybe a year later, Jesus crossed over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And then parenthetically, he tells the reader that the Sea of Galilee is also called the Sea of Tiberias. Now, this is an interesting little detail that John puts in here, because he wants to make sure that his Greek readers understand exactly where we're talking about. And also, he's writing at a time when the Roman government is being very, very aggressive toward the Christians, and the name Tiberias was a Roman name. You see, the Sea of Galilee was known by many different names. In 20 A.D., not too awful long before this gospel was written, Tiberius, the Caesar had built a city on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee and named it Tiberias in honor of the former emperor Tiberius. So as a result, the body of water took on the name Sea of Tiberias. Now, it's also called, in other places, it's called the Sea of Gennesaret, and it's called a couple of other names in the scriptures. So this body of water that we call the Sea of Galilee, let me explain to you what it is. The Jordan River is flowing from the north in the mountains south. It is going to eventually flow and empty into the Dead Sea. However, along the way, there's a wide spot in the river, if you will, and that's called the Sea of Galilee. It's we think of the word sea as something much larger. It's more like a lake. It was sometimes referred to as Lake Gennesaret. But the idea is that it is a body of water. The river flows into this area, water gathers, and then flows out in the south, going south in the Jordan River down to the Dead Sea. So it's really a wide spot in the river. Okay? This, on the northwestern shore, was the city of Capernaum, and that was where Jesus made his headquarters during his Galilean ministry. What we're told is that at some point in time, he crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now, what we're going to learn is, when we read the whole passage, and from implication, when we're talking about going to the far shore, he's not talking about going from northwest to southeast, but he's talking about going across the north part of the lake itself. To go from Capernaum on the northwestern shore over to the spot where we're talking about would be about 4 miles by water. So it's a good size lake. Don't get me wrong, it is a large body of water, but it's not like a sea that we think of. Okay? He says he's gone to the far side. Now, Mark and Luke tell us that this particular trip was made at the time when Jesus had sent his 12 disciples out. They had ministered in the nearby towns and villages, performing miracles. They had come back and had reported to him, and that he then made this trip across the northern part of the sea. Mark chapter 6, verse 30. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." Okay? So the suggestion is that this is an attempt to get away where they can find some peace, some quietness, so he can talk with his disciples and teach them. Matthew tells us that they left for a solitary place because they had just received the news of the execution of John the Baptist. And we know that Herod had made noises about wanting to hear from Jesus, and maybe he was leaving. Matthew suggests he was leaving to get away from that particular news event. Whatever the motivation, whether they were going to find peace and quiet, or whether they were going to avoid opposition, and John doesn't tell us. John simply says that they go to the far side of the Sea of Tiberias. Then in verse 2 he says, "And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick." A great crowd follows him. Now, Mark explains it this way. He says, "But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them." Now let me explain a little geography here. We're talking about going along the northern shoreline of the Sea of Galilee. Okay? As I mentioned to you before, the Jordan River flows in from the north into the Sea of Galilee and then flows out from the south down into the sea, to the Dead Sea. Where the river enters the Lake Gennesaret, or the Sea of Galilee, there is that's the Jordan River, and the Jordan River divides the land on the northern side of the lake into two separate provinces. When Rome is in control, they've set up these political governing districts, and there are two provinces. On the west side is the province of Galilee. On the east side is the province of Julius. Now, where this river flows into the sea, this is a place where there has been a town created called Bethsaida. there is a part of the town on the east side of the river and part of the town on the west side of the river. The part of the town on the west side of the river is called Bethsaida of Galilee. The part of the city that's on the east side of the river is called Bethsaida of Julius, the province there. We know that Philip was from Bethsaida. We've heard that. John has told us that earlier on. It is in this particular area that we believe, the commentators believe, that this particular event took place. So whatever his motivation, they go looking for this spot, and a crowd has followed them. A crowd has followed them. Maybe it's because they're miracle mongers. Maybe, John also tells us that it was near the Passover, the Jewish Passover feast was near. He tells us that in verse 4. We do know that many people would be going from Galilee down to Jerusalem for the Passover. And we know that a respectable Jew would not go through Samaria straight south. So they would go across the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee to the east side of the Sea of Galilee, then down the east side of the Sea of Galilee, on down the east side of the Jordan River, and then cross back across the Jordan River into Judea, down across from Jericho. It took a lot longer, but that avoided Samaria. So whether the large crowds have come running from all the towns because they've heard about the miracle worker is making his way eastward, or whether it's that plus pilgrims who would be traveling, making their way to Jerusalem for the Passover feast. John seems to suggest there may have been some of that. Whatever their motivation, the crowd followed him. And a crowd, we're told by the synoptics, the crowd actually reaches there before Jesus and the disciples get there. Now, John gives us a little different view, but I will get to that in just a minute. What you need to understand, though, is that if you're making your way on foot from Capernaum, going east along the northern shore, when you get to the Jordan River where it flows into the Sea of Galilee, you can't cross there. You have to go northward to find the ford, and the city is actually built to the north. The ford is like 2 miles north of the seashore itself. To go from Capernaum by land across this way up to the ford the river, and come back down on the other side was a distance of 9 miles. Now, what I want you to see is they've made that they're going pretty quickly. They're going in a hurry. Jesus and his disciples are not in any hurry. These people on land are traveling in a hurry because we're told by the synoptics they actually reach this spot before Jesus gets there. Well, the crowd is there. John describes it this way. He says, a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. And then he tells us that it was the Jewish Passover time. The suggestion is Jesus sees this crowd, so he actually goes up on a mountainside and sits down with his disciples and begins to teach and work with them. Hopefully, I would suggest, he was hoping that he was going to be able to do so in some privacy up there on the mountainside. Now, John describes being up on the mountainside. The synoptics talk about the feeding of the 5,000 as down on a plain. Well, these are consistent because look what happens. John describes when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip. So he's up on the mountainside and he sees down in the plain this big crowd coming in. That prompts him to ask Philip a question. And he asks Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Now, John explains to us. It's as though he's read Jesus' mind, and he wants us to be sure we understand Jesus' purpose. He, Jesus, asked this only to test him, Philip. For he, Jesus, already had in mind what he, Jesus, was going to do. So they're up on the mountainside, the crowd's gathering down below. Jesus sees this crowd, and he asks Philip this question to test him. Now, before we get to that point, let's talk about the difference. In the Synoptics, the gospel writers suggest that it was the disciples who went to Jesus and asked Jesus, how are we going to feed these people? In fact, one of the Synoptic writers tells us that they had been there all afternoon, and it was getting late in the afternoon, and they went and asked Jesus. And in the Synoptics, Jesus asked them, what do you have? And they said just this. Well, first of all, Jesus said, you feed them. And of course, that wouldn't be very comforting, because with all these many people, and we're going to find out there were 5,000 men plus women and children, that wasn't going to be an easy task. And when Jesus said, you feed them, that would have been kind of a challenge with the impossible. But Jesus sees the crowd, by John's account, and he asks Philip. Philip was the right person to ask, because Philip was from this area. Philip knew where you could get food to feed a crowd, to feed a hungry crowd. But Philip immediately recognizes the impossible. Now, Jesus asked him this question not because Jesus didn't know what to do. Jesus already, John tells us, already had in his mind what he was going to do. But rather, he was testing Philip. Now think with me. Philip has been with Jesus and has seen all of these miracles done. He's seen the sick raised up. He's seen the lame walking. He's seen the blind seeing. He's seen all these miracles. Now he has an impossible situation, a lack of food. What kind of faith does he have? Well, Philip is caught up in the human. Philip sees things strictly from a human perspective. And when he sees things from a human perspective, he sees two problems. One, where are we going to find the food? That was the question Jesus asked. But Philip says, we got a more important problem than that. Even if we could find a market that had enough food, we don't have enough money. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. He says, 200 denarii. A denarius was a day's wage. 200 days of wages would not be enough to buy bread so that everybody could have just one little bite. So Jesus, we got an impossible situation. Not only do you want to know where, how are we going to find someplace, but secondly, how are you going to buy it? We don't have that kind of money. He has identified the impossible, at least from the human perspective. So Jesus asked him, he says, where? And he answers, but we don't have enough money. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will that go among so many? Evidently, they have gone down now, and they're mixing and mingling with the crowd, because Peter has found this. Andrew, Peter's brother, has found this young boy. Now, in the Greek, the word that John uses, quoting Andrew's reference to the young boy, was a word that specifically means very small boy. Not a teenager, but a small boy. Now, it seems that this small boy was with the crowd, and he had with him a basket, and in the basket he had a picnic lunch. Now, we read that very quickly, but we need to stop and evaluate what that lunch meant. Whether he was simply from one of the nearby towns and traveling, caught up with the group, looking for this miracle worker, or whether he was with his family on his way to Jerusalem. We don't know. But we know he's got a lunch, a basket. But what's in the basket? Well, we have 5 loaves of barley bread. At least that's how John describes it, and that's translated in the NIV. 5 small barley loaves. In the Greek, the word that's translated loaves is not like, that does not mean the loaf that we're familiar with. We're thinking of a loaf of bread. The word that in the Greek that the NIV translated as loaves really meant small cake. It was just a small bite-sized cake. So instead of 5 loaves of bread, we've got 5 little cakes. And the 2 fish. The Greek word that's used for fish suggests a very small fish. Now, let's talk about the custom of that day. There were supplies of very small sardine-like fish that were caught from the Sea of Galilee that would be dried and salted to preserve it. And this would be a lunch, to carry a couple of these small fish to use kind of like a relish or to put on a little cake of bread. That would be lunch. But it was more significant, the value of this lunch is more significant than just the fact it's 5 small loaves, 5 small cakes of barley bread and 2 little fish. For you see, it was barley bread. It wasn't wheat bread. There's a major distinction. We don't necessarily see that distinction. Barley was considered to be the grain of the very, very poor. Barley was that which only the very, very poor ate. The idea is that this was not only a boy with a small lunch, but he was a poor boy with a small lunch. Barley was only of 1/3 the value of wheat. So you see, poor boy, small lunch, and this is what Andrew has found. Andrew says, I've got this. If this would be about enough for a small boy to eat, how is that going to go so far amongst so many? So look what happens. Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in the place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. It's obvious Jesus is in charge. They've come off the mountainside. They're down on the plain where the people are, and Jesus gives instructions to tell the people to sit down. Now, the fact that we're talking about down on the plain means there's lots of flat land for them to sit on. And John tells us there was plenty of grass. Now, he's told us it's the Passover season. The Passover season not only tells us something about the fact that people are traveling, but it also tells us the time of year. That is, this is the spring of the year in which there would be a lot of grass out there. So they sat down on the grass. Now, the synoptics tell us that he actually had them sit down in groups and organized it. John just says he had them sit down. And an interesting thing enough, there wasn't any mention of any food. Yet 5,000 men plus women and children sat down, even though they hadn't seen any food. There hadn't been any mention of food. The fact Jesus was in charge, the fact they were paying attention to him, is underscored. So he says, he had them sit down. Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. Then he did the same with the fish. Now here's a picture. Jesus takes these little cakes of bread. He gives thanks. This would be a very familiar image or picture for the head of any household, the father of any family. When the family was sitting down to eat, he would take the food and bless it. Okay? So he blesses the food, the bread. the barley bread. Now, it's interesting that John says it this way. He says, he took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed those loaves to those who were seated. Now, being technical, there may be an implication that there were some who didn't sit down and they didn't get anything to eat. Or it may be this is the way of describing who these people are as opposed to giving it to the disciples. Now, that's the point though. In the Synoptics, we're told that Jesus broke the bread, he blessed it, broke it, and gave it to the disciples, who then distributed it. John says Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those. Now, the commentators debate as to whether Jesus is actually doing the distribution to all 5,000 or whether he has distributed to them via the 12 disciples. It doesn't really matter, but the point is Jesus was very involved with this. So he breaks the bread, he blesses the bread, he breaks it, he distributes it. Then he does the same for the fish. Now, realistically, to give a piece of bread, to give bread and fish to 5,000 people by yourself would be a major task. So it's very reasonable that he has used the 12 disciples and that they have in turn used others. Bottom line is the people are fed. And we're told by John, he says that we had 5,000 people there. 5,000 men there. Where do we find that? There was plenty of grass and about 5,000 of them. Now, suggesting men. In the Synoptics, it clearly says, Matthew's Gospel says, there were 5,000 men plus women and children. So, the 5,000 plus women and children. 6,000, 8,000? Your guess. Those people have been fed, and it's not just that they've had something to eat. It says that they had as much as they wanted. When Jesus distributed it, he distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And then in verse 12 it says, and when they had enough to eat. The Greek verbs that are used here by John carry with it the implication. When these verbs are used of feeding humans, we're talking about feeding them till they were full, feeding them until they were satisfied. So it's not just that they got something to eat, they got all they wanted to eat. We're talking about abundance. Abundance. From 5 little cakes of barley bread and 2 little sardine-like fish, we've had 5,000 men plus children. They instructed them to eat as much as they wanted, and they did. Then look in verse 12 what he says. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to the disciples, gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with pieces of barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. 12 basket loaves left over. Question often comes to people's mind, where did they get the baskets? Well, we need to understand something about the culture of that day. The culture of that day, when you traveled, you had to carry certain things with you, and the Jews were known for carrying a basket, a oval-shaped basket. Barclay describes it this way. He says, of the fragments, 12 baskets, 12 baskets were taken up. No doubt each of the disciples had his basket. A kophonos was what the Greek word is. It was a bottle-shaped basket, and no Jew ever traveled without his. The Jew was, with his inseparable basket, was a notorious figure. He carried it partly because he was characteristically acquisitive, buying things, picking up things, needing somewhere to carry it with him. And partly because he needed to carry his own food if he was going to observe the Jewish rules of cleanness and uncleanness. So many travelers would actually carry clean food in their basket so that they would be able to eat clean food and not defile themselves by eating unclean food. So each of them probably had at least one basket. People ask, why 12 baskets? Well, each of them had a basket. They were able to fill it up. Again, indicating abundance and the fact that Jesus doesn't waste anything. He doesn't waste anything. And it wasn't just that they had enough to eat. There was an overabundance of what they needed. And he said, at the people, let's go to verse 14. And after the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is come into the world. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to the mountains by himself. Okay, here's the picture. They see him do this sign, this miracle of feeding the 5,000 men plus women and children from this small lunch. They're caught up. He must be a prophet. Now, why would they think he's a prophet? Well, remember, steeped into their lineage, in their heritage, was Moses. And what happened with Moses when he was leading the children of Israel through the wilderness? When he was leading them on the way to the promised land, and then as they struggled through the wilderness, they would come to times where they had no food. Yet God provided them food, manna, quail. He fed them through his servant. And so they see Jesus as being a prophet, like Moses. Now, they also knew from their Old Testament studies that God had promised Moses that one day he would raise up a prophet like Moses. And they were looking for that one to be their Messiah. Later on, they got prophecies through Isaiah and the other prophets about the coming of this Messiah. They got the prophecy through Daniel of this one who would be the Son of Man, who would be given the authority to establish the kingdom. So they were looking for this prophet, this Messiah, but they were looking for him to come and overthrow Rome, because they saw this as the establishment of a new earthly kingdom. Jesus left Jerusalem when he was doing his miracles because he understood that was the limitation of their understanding. Now here he is, and these people have seen these miracles, this miracle, but their understanding is so limited because they don't understand Messiah in true Messiahship, but they understand Messiah as they want to define him. And John tells us Jesus was afraid they were going to take and try to make him a military ruler, and so he withdraws to the mountain by himself. Now, later on in this chapter, John will record a discourse by Jesus wherein Jesus is explaining the feeding of the 5,000. Now, later on we find that after Jesus and the disciples get back over to the west side of the lake, people who had been there and fed that day meet Jesus, and they say to Jesus, basically, we've been looking for you. Where'd you go? What happened to you? And Jesus says to them, the only reason you wanted to see me again is because you got a free meal the first time and you want another free meal. And then in teaching his disciples, he gives them the language about, I am the bread of life. And he that eats, in other words, we're taking this sign and moving from the physical to the spiritual. I am the bread of life, and he who eats of my bread will never hunger again. Again, John's helping us understand the symbolism, the sign of the miraculous act. Okay, so we've got this account by John of this supernatural event. We've got three particular persons involved that we want to go back and just mention a moment or two. First of all, we've got Philip. Philip sees things through the human. He's seen all these miracles Jesus has done. He now sees an impossible situation in the human. And when Jesus asks him, where are we going to get the food? He doesn't have a clue. He doesn't have a clue. One writer made this observation about Philip. He says, with greater faith and knowledge, Philip might have said, Master, I don't know where the food is to feed the crowd, but you're greater than Moses, whom God used to feed the multitude every day in the wilderness, and God certainly does a lesser work through a greater servant. You're greater than Elisha, whom God used to feed many sons of the prophets through little food. What is more, the scriptures say, the man shall not live by bread alone, and you're great enough to fill this multitude with the words from your mouth. If he had had a little more faith, he might have relied. He saw things, let's not be too harsh on him, he saw things through the human. How many times are we tempted to limit our understanding of circumstances to the human? Then we got Andrew. Andrew was known throughout the New Testament for bringing people to Jesus. Andrew brought his brother Simon Peter to Jesus. Andrew would later be the one who would bring the Greeks to Jesus. Andrew brought this little boy to Jesus. So here is an example of someone who is constantly bringing people to Jesus. A lesson for us to learn. The other thing, though, we need to look at is the little boy. We don't know anything about this little boy. Yet when Andrew asked him for his lunch, he, in blind faith, gave it up. Now, some people have an explanation for this miracle that is very, very secular and humanistic. Some people say that really what happened on this day was the little boy is simply symbolic of the other men in the crowd. That is, that the crowd, the men in the crowd who were traveling, especially if they were on their way to Jerusalem, they would have been carrying food with them. So therefore they would have had food. And that the miracle was not that 5 cakes became bread for 5,000 plus. The miracle was that they were able to talk these men into sharing with one another so that everyone had enough to eat. So the miracle was not in the dividing of the physical food. The miracle was in the change of attitude so that everyone shared with one another. That's for those who have trouble believing in miracles, that is a way to explain it. But when we look at it, this little boy was willing to give up his lunch. Something he had that maybe others didn't have. And it was just one very small lunch. And it would have been easy to say, as did Andrew, what's such a little lunch going to do for such a large crowd? Yet it was in that childlike faith. He simply gave it up. There's our lesson. Our lesson of childlike faith. Let's see our circumstances, this lesson is telling us, through a faith, not through the human limitations of Philip, but through a faith. Let us be eager to be about bringing people to Jesus. And let us trust and believe with a childlike faith to offer whatever it is we have. I only have 5 little barley cakes and 2 little sardines. But if what I have can be of use to you, here, I give it to you. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this reminder of your love for us, the compassion you had on this crowd, your compassion you have for us. May we understand that our temptation is to limit our perspective to our humanness, but that you have come to give us a whole new perspective. And as we see our problems, our circumstances, the situations of our daily life, may we see them through a perspective that has that childlike faith. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And we understand that to enjoy this relationship, we simply offer to you what we have. Not because what we have is so special or so important, but because you ask, whatever I have, here it is. Take me, use me. And for what you will do for me, and what you will do through me, as I give to you, I thank you and praise you in Jesus' name.